Good morning. My name's Marina, and today's reading is from Psalm 139, verses 13 through 18. For it was you who formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, that I know very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes beheld my unformed substance. In your book were written all the days that were formed for me, when none of them as yet existed. How weighty to me are your thoughts, O God! How vast is the sum of them! I try to count them, they are more than the sand. I come to the end, I am still with you. The word of God for the people of God.
Good morning, everyone. Give me just 1 second to figure out where I'm going to be. As Daniel mentioned at the beginning of the service, my name's Caleb, and it is always a blessing and a privilege to be here with you all and have a chance to talk with you all. I have two questions that I want you to think about to get us started this morning, and I'm about to ask the first one. And after I ask it, I'm just gonna pause. I'm gonna fall silent for a little while because I really want you to think about it. I want you to come up with an answer in your head. It could get just like a tiny bit awkward, but if I can handle it, then you can handle it. All right, are you ready for the first question? All right, when was the last time you felt a powerful sense of awe and wonder? Say it one more time. When was the last time you felt a powerful sense of awe and wonder? Okay, all right. That's as long as I can last. The silence is it's unnerving from up here. Anyway, I hope you had a chance to come up with an answer or a partial answer in your head. The last time you felt a sense of awe and wonder. When I was thinking about this question this past week, two answers popped up into my head. I have a picture for the first one. This is me, and I am sitting at the top of the Black Canyon of the Gunnison in Colorado on a trip that my wife and I took a couple summers before our daughter was born. And the Black Canyon is sometimes referred to as like the Grand Canyon of Colorado. It's a really amazing national park that I think is still kind of under people's radar. I can't recommend the trip highly enough. When you first get there, you pull into the park and it feels like nothing is there. It feels like you just pulled into a parking lot in the middle of the Colorado desert for no reason. But then you get out of your car and you start kind of hiking down this little trail, and suddenly the entire earth just disappears. The ground just like falls away beneath your feet. And it is like to the point that it's disorienting. It takes a second for your brain to rearrange the information that it's getting from your eyes into something that makes sense. It's really, really incredible. And Beck and I, we just sat at the edge of this canyon for I don't even know how long, an hour, 2 hours, whatever. And I'm not sure it's coming across in my facial expression here, but as I was sitting there eating my goldfish, I had just a powerful experience of wonder and of awe, an overwhelming sense of the beauty of this world, the sense that I was in the presence of something wild and large and other, something different and bigger than myself. Another recent time that I felt a sense of awe and wonder was actually at the Kindred Christmas Eve service this past December. It was the first time that my wife and I were in town and were able to attend the service with our daughters. And in this service, I had my 2-year-old daughter on our lap. And as we started to sing Silent Night together, she started to try to sing it with me in that crazy, adorable, but very non-musical way that 2-year-olds sing. And I was surrounded by this church family that we just love and appreciate so much, and contemplating the incarnation of Jesus, God come down into earth. And I, again, had a sort of semi-transcendent experience of wonder and awe. Obviously very different from staring into a massive canyon, but had a lot of similarities, a sense of something other, something bigger than myself, binding me to my daughter, binding me to my church family, maybe even binding me to God. There's this guy named Rudolph Otto, And Rudolf Otto was a very influential 20th century theologian, and he is famous for giving a really powerful and interesting word to these sorts of experiences. He described these experiences as the numinous. I really like that word. I just think it's a great word. The numinous. According to Merriam-Webster, the numinous is an adjective meaning filled with a sense of the presence of divinity, spiritually elevated and sublime. When a feeling of wonder and awe escalates into something that is beyond just mere enjoyment or happiness or appreciation, and it seems to bump up against someone, capital S, that's an experience of the numinous. The second question that I have for you, and I'm not going to do the awkward pause thing for this one, but I do want you to think about it for a minute. Is a parking space ever more than just a parking space? And here's what I mean by that. I have a picture for this one as well. Just a heads up, I'm looking much worse for wear in this picture. Yeah, this is me as well. The story behind this picture is that one Sunday afternoon, my brother Jay and I, we were playing racquetball. And we don't need that up there this whole time. And while we were playing racquetball, Jay hit this shot that forced me up towards the front of the wall. And I don't know if you've ever played racquetball, but that's not a good place to be. So I knew that if I was going to win the point, I was going to have to turn around and get back into position really quickly. So I hit the rallying shot, and I turn around, and as soon as I turn around, just shebang. Jay absolutely nails me in the eye with the racquetball. Totally on accident, obviously, but I was not wearing goggles. And side note, if you or your loved ones are ever going to play racquetball, you must wear goggles, for real. I just realized that's the main thing I want you to take away from this sermon. If you're going to play racquetball, you must wear goggles. Let's pray. No, I'm just kidding. Anyway, after this happened, I couldn't see anything in this eye at all. It was 100% blacked out. And Jay and I, we still had some kind of silly young adult energy. Shall we call it my parents? And we're like, hey, so Caleb got hit in the eye. He can't see anything. Is this like an emergency room sort of situation? And my mom was like, he's blind? Yes, go to the emergency room. So we go to the emergency room. I'm Googling blunt eye trauma on the way there, and I'm getting more and more anxious because it seems like permanent damage is very much on the table, especially if I can't, get some treatment pretty quickly. And the hospital's kind of overrun. It's a little bit confusing about where we're supposed to go. We can't find a place to put our car. And then right as we figure out where the sort of emergency triage area is, this car just at the very, very front happens to pull out and gives Jay a place to kind of pull in, and we get out and I see a doctor. And I don't have any long-lasting damage at all, so it all worked out. Praise be to God. But I'll tell you what my grandma would say about what happened there. My grandma would tell me that parking space was not just a parking space. My grandma would tell me that was God looking out for me. She would tell me that God knew that I was freaking out, that God made sure I was going to have that parking space. She might even tell me that parking space was an occasion for wonder and awe, maybe even the numinous. It was evidence that God was at work and that God is present and active in my life. So is a parking space ever more than just a parking space? Our scripture reading for this morning is a portion of Psalm 139, and that's one of my favorite psalms in the Bible, and I think that I say that every week, but they're just all so good. There's a ton going on in Psalm 139, but for this morning, I want to zoom in on the fact that the psalmist seems to be having one of those awe-inspiring, one of those numinous experiences of God. I'm going to read just a short portion. I think this is from earlier in the psalm that we didn't read, but it's a good part. The psalmist says, God, you study my traveling and my resting. You have learned all of my ways. You know where I need to park, in other words. There's not yet a word on my tongue, O God, but look, you know it completely. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is so high that I cannot attain it. So when the psalmist is thinking about how God knows and directs her life, it leads her into this sense of wonder and awe, into the numinous, into a presence of divinity. Here's another snippet, and this part we did read. The psalmist says, "For it was you, God, who formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, that I know very well." And here I think we could imagine the psalmist like looking at her hands, looking at the way her arms move and the way all the different pieces of her body work and function together. And again, it ushers her into awe, into a powerful sense of God's presence and God's person. Now, whoever wrote this psalm, and we don't really know who wrote it, but whoever wrote it, it was definitely an ancient person living hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years before Jesus came, thousands of years before the rise of things like science and modern medicine and contemporary physics and all that sort of stuff. And arguably it was easier to feel wonder and awe in the year 500 BCE. Because I want you to imagine for a minute that you are an ancient person living in ancient times, and you've never had a single biology or geology lesson because none of those categories or concepts even existed yet. And then imagine that you experience a massive and powerful thunder and lightning storm. What would you think was happening? You are not going to think like, wow, the static shock's like really built up in those cumulus clouds. You don't have any of those categories. No, quite understandably, ancient people thought that thunder was the voice of a god, perhaps even many gods, like fighting with one another. They believed that gods, lowercase g, or God, uppercase G, determined anything and everything that happened to them, from illness to disease to a bountiful harvest or a lean harvest. Everything in the ancient world, in other words, was an occasion for awe and for wonder and for the numinous. But then history continues, and we develop things like the scientific method and microscopes and telescopes and all of those things, and this all sort of changed. And the technical million-dollar word for this change is demythologization. That is 7 syllables, in case you were counting. Basically, all that means is that human beings went from assigning a kind of divine supernatural cause to essentially all things. We went from seeing a spirit behind every tree and every blade of grass to believing that basically everything has a natural, materialistic explanation behind it. Thunder is a sonic boom. Thunder is not a divine war cry. And obviously, I think we would all agree that this process of demythologization, it had massive benefits, right? When you stop believing that every crop yield is dependent on whether or not God is happy with you, then you can start developing fertilizer, right? And when you stop believing that every illness is caused by evil spirits, you can start washing your hands and you start developing modern medicine. There's a lot of good outcomes from demythologization. That's the last time I'll use that word. There's a cost, though, I think. There's been a bit of a downside, and the downside is that it can be much more difficult to feel wonder and awe nowadays. It is incredibly tempting, in other words, to conclude in this scientific and largely secular world that we live in, that a parking space, it's always just a parking space. Because we know how things work. And we don't need God to explain them. We know that lightning is just lightning. We know that coincidences, they can just be coincidences. And often, this kind of like highly reductionistic way of thinking goes beyond just parking spaces, right? The love that I felt for my daughter and my church family at the Kindred Christmas Eve service, yeah, that's like an evolutionary impulse, right? It's just the drive to protect the next generation and to find a social group to help me raise them. Even my awe at the Black Canyon, it's just a strange combination of a very typical fear but fascination with heights. There's nothing unnatural, surely nothing supernatural about that. Maybe the psalmist in our reading could like look at her hand and be awed at God's craftsmanship. But I look at my hand and like, I remember something in biology about like opposable thumbs being important for getting Homo sapiens to the tool wielding phase. And sometimes, even while I'm having these experiences, or maybe like just directly after I have them, I start to feel even like a little bit silly. Like I was duped into thinking for even like a second that something, a worship service, a powerful and life-giving meal with friends, that thinking that it was something more, that there was anything numinous, that there was anything divine about it. Because, I don't know, well-educated 21st century people, we just don't really think in that way. This week is the second week in our sermon series on science and religion, which is a super interesting and important and fascinating topic. And often is in discussions of science and religion, especially in a Christian context, the topics of apologetics crops up. Has anybody heard of apologetics before? Anybody go through an apologetics phase? Maybe just me on that one. I did, personally. For the uninitiated, apologetics, it's basically the attempt to construct rational and scientific arguments for the existence of God, for the resurrection of Jesus, or all these other different matters of faith. And I was super into this stuff in high school because I was on the debate team, and so apologetics, it was like debate for Jesus, right? And I had memorized various arguments for the existence of God. This was a book that I had on my bookshelf. I think I probably still have it on my bookshelf. It's by William Lane Craig. You can't see the subtitle here, but it's called On Guard, Defending Your Faith with Reason and Precision. And yeah, this book is basically just like a list of apologetic talking points that you can memorize and spring on people at dinner parties or whatever. And just based on the cover of this book, you can see how this stuff is normally framed, right? It's a very adversarial, even like violent image. Arguments are swords that we use to like defend the faith and vanquish skeptics or whatever. And by the time I got to college, I personally had just started to think that this stuff wasn't like super helpful. For one, I don't think that very many people can be argued into wanting to follow Jesus. Maybe there's a couple, but it's not that many. Very few people, upon losing a debate to an especially articulate Christian, just throw their hands up in the air and say, well, dang, I guess I have to rearrange my entire life around following Jesus now. That just doesn't really happen. And the second reason is that I don't actually think that our faith is dependent on the latest issue of philosophy today or on the Scientific American. Personally, I don't follow Jesus because the evidence for God is just so overwhelming that I cannot reasonably and rationally endorse any other worldview. I do, as you're going to hear, I do think the evidence for God is pretty robust. But I worship God, I follow Jesus for a full assortment of other much more nuanced relational reasons that have almost nothing to do with the ontological argument for the existence of God. So my apologetics phase, it just kind of petered out in early college, I would say. But lately, I have started to wonder if some of these apologetics adjacent concepts, the logical, even the scientific and natural evidence for God that is out there, I've started to wonder if it might be repurposed for something that's a bit more productive, a bit more helpful. What if, rather than seeing rational and scientific evidence for God as this sword that we use to stab unbelievers with or something, I don't know. Maybe instead we can think about it as permission to feel awe and wonder about the world, about the things that we don't understand, about the God who does, I believe, make God's presence felt in the world around us. Because there are things, I think, that science cannot explain. There are interesting and there are wild things about this world. There are things that the process of demythologization, I guess that was last time, I'll say it, sorry, has not sucked the wonder and the mystery and the awe out of it. In some instances, I think that the things that we've learned about the natural world over the last 1,000 years or so have actually given us more reason to be awed and to be overwhelmed by its artistry and its sophistication. For instance, has anybody heard of the strong nuclear force before? Anybody heard of that one? Nobody. Nope, one person. All right, great. The strong nuclear force. It's super interesting. It's this force. It's the force that holds atoms together, that holds matter, that just holds stuff together, and that makes sure that protons and neutrons don't just go flying apart from one another in different directions. And physicists have determined that if the strong nuclear force was just a teeny tiny bit more or less powerful than it is, then not only would life be impossible, but planets would have never formed. And the entire universe would just be like this lukewarm soup of protons floating in nothingness. The cosmological constant is another one of these things. The cosmological constant refers to how quickly the universe seems to be expanding, how quickly things like stars and planets and galaxies seem to be moving away from us deeper into space. And similarly to the nuclear force, if this rate of expansion was even infinitesimally faster or slower than it is, then the entire universe would have just immediately collapsed in on itself, and none of us would be here today. The odds that this cosmological constant would just be randomly set at this perfect rate, that we would just have won this cosmological lottery, they are 1 chance in 10 to the 120th power. That means that there's 1 chance of this number. If you were to try to count to this number, it would take you That many years. We still don't even have words to describe this number to you. So to sum up this point, modern physics, contemporary knowledge in other words, stuff that the psalmist had no idea about, modern physics has essentially uncovered this like set of dials that undergird the very structure of the universe. And if these dials were even infinitesimally adjusted, human beings would have never arrived. And as far as I know, I'm not an expert here, but as far as I can tell, there is no logical or necessary reason why these dials need to be set where they are set at. But somehow, we just have happened to end up in a universe that is precisely and incredibly and unbelievably finely tuned in order to allow for the emergence of life, in order to make it possible for all of us to be here this morning. And I personally think that it's totally reasonable to conclude that someone, capital S, made sure that that was the case. Last week, Daniel mentioned that this sermon series was going to maybe appeal to our inner nerds and for some of us, our outer nerds as well. And I've obviously taken that and just run with it, right? And we're going to go deeper. We're going even deeper because I want to talk to you for a second about neuroscience, specifically the attempt in the cognitive sciences to understand, the attempt of brain scientists to understand consciousness. That movie that's running behind your eyes 24/7, and the you that seems to be there and interacting with things, your consciousness. When attempting to understand consciousness, scientists talk about the easy problems of consciousness and the so-called the hard problem of consciousness. If we're going to start with an easy problem, and obviously it's only easy relatively speaking, nothing in neuroscience, it's all hard, but the easy problem in neuroscience is that people that study this sort of thing, they can explain, at least in part, how our brain parses and makes sense of information. Imagine that picture of me sitting at the Black Canyon of the Gunnison again. Cognitive scientists can, at least in part, explain how my brain is able to receive and arrange information coming in through my eyes, and then after a minute of disorientation can make sense of what I'm looking at, can arrange it into the canyon walls and the tiny little river. That's the easy problem of consciousness, parsing and making sense of information. But what's crazy, and I really don't think I'm speaking out of turn here, is that we have no idea why it feels the way that it feels to see those sort of things. Why doesn't my brain, like a self-driving Tesla, just dispassionately register, oh, that's a canyon, don't step into it, and then I move on? Why am I floored by the beauty of it all? Why do I sit and stare at it for hours? Why does it feel so amazing and strange? That's the hard problem of consciousness, and no one knows how to answer it. Here's one more angle on this, because I know this is pretty intense stuff. Your Roomba does all sorts of complex math and processing in its processor, in its brain, so to speak, right? But it doesn't feel like anything to be a Roomba. It has no consciousness. There is no movie or voice in the head of your Roomba. It doesn't feel weariness at the end of the day. It doesn't regret starting with the living room instead of the dining room. But why does it feel like something to be a human being? We could imagine a robot that does all of the things that you and I do, that eats food to sustain itself, that makes sure a car isn't going to smush it when it crosses the road, that even walks around in the woods to stay fit or something, but that does so without any inner life, without the movie running behind its eyeballs, without a self that seems to be making decisions and regretting those decisions and feeling happiness or sadness about the results of those decisions. But for some reason, the cognitive science, as far as I can tell, is nowhere close to answering. We do feel all of those things. It feels like something to be us. I just think that's wild when you think about it. How in the world do we go from neurons firing in our brain to the feeling of intense relief that I get when I take that first sip of Kindred coffee in the morning? How do we get from eyeballs that can distinguish between different shades of orange to the feeling, the sense of beauty that those colors evoke in me and in us? Why in the world would a nervous system that theoretically evolved to help us run away from tigers in the jungle, why would that nervous system also allow us to create art like the Mona Lisa and the Shawshank Redemption and to be moved by those things? Maybe our consciousness has an immaterial, a spiritual, a supernatural element to it. Maybe if we want to really understand our consciousness, we need outdated, even ancient terms to help us do that. The word soul comes to mind. Maybe our consciousness is itself a reflection of, maybe it was made in the image of someone, capital S, who is himself immaterial, whose thoughts, the psalmist says, are so weighty and so vast they outnumber the sand. I mean, maybe. I just think it's worth thinking about. I got one more point before we try to land the plane here, and this one doesn't have any crazy scientific terms in it, I promise. This one gets a little kooky, though. It gets a little weird, and I think maybe we all have our own sort of personal kookiness tolerance level, and if your kookiness tolerance level is particularly low, this might push you just a little bit outside your comfort zone, but it's going to be okay. Stick with me. I promise you that my kookiness tolerance level is not like crazy high, and we're gonna go there together. You would have thought that with the rise of science and rationality and secular culture and everything, you would have thought that powerful and seemingly unexplainable spiritual experiences would just like have totally dried up, that they would not happen at all anymore. But for a surprisingly significant number of people today, that it just doesn't seem to be the case. Now, I want to be clear. I personally have only ever had what you might call like grade B spiritual experiences. They're the ones I described to you at the beginning of the sermon. My sense of awe at the Black Canyon, a sense of connection and love at the Christmas Eve service. Experiences that seemed to me to push beyond myself to something spiritual, to something divine. There was nothing irreducibly or obviously miraculous about them. I'm sure they could be explained in other ways. But if you have an open mind, if you're willing to read about, if you're willing to talk to a wide variety of people, and if you are willing to at least momentarily suspend the conclusion that they are all con artists or that they are all insane, you will find people out there today having what you might think of as like grade A spiritual experiences. Overwhelming encounters that literally knock them off their feet. Seemingly miraculous healings, some of which end up being written up in scientific journals. Powerful, bizarre, near-death experiences that completely change how that person approaches and lives their life. That sort of stuff. If your kookiness tolerance is pretty high, if this is at all interesting to you, Craig Keener is a professor at Asbury University. He's written a peer-reviewed book from Baker Academic that's legit, called Miracles Today, that addresses this issue and is a good place to start. Now, crucially, not all of these accounts come from Christians or remotely religious people. Michael Shermer, you can look up Michael Shermer. He's literally the editor of Skeptic magazine. And he still is a proud atheist. But one day, Shermer posted on his blog telling his audience of eager skeptics, about an extremely strange experience that he and his wife had. Shermer's partner had an old radio that belonged to a grandpa that she dearly, dearly loved, but who passed away when she was 16. The radio was the only keepsake that she had of her grandpa, so she took it with her as she moved all across the world, despite the fact that it had been dead for decades. And Michael Shermer, when he started dating his partner, he had tried to, he has some know-how, he tried to fix it up and get it working at various times, but he ultimately just gave up. But then, according to Michael Shermer's blog post, on their wedding night, after they had gotten back to their home, Michael and his new wife, you can tell where this is going, they suddenly heard music. Romantic music coming from somewhere. And they couldn't figure it out. They started tearing apart the house looking for an iPhone or an Alexa speaker that they had forgotten about. And they found the radio in her desk, just belting out classical music. And Michael's new wife immediately burst into tears and said something like, my grandpa's here with us. It played all night long, and then it never worked again. And like I said, this experience did not turn Michael Shermer into a Christian or even someone who believes in God, but it did, and here I'm quoting his blog post, shake my skepticism to the core. I don't know what you think happened with that radio. I'll tell you what I think might have happened. I think that the universe seems to have been fine-tuned in such a way as to produce creatures like us, who have not only brains, but who also have a consciousness, who have felt experiential life, and that sometimes one of the things that we experience is a someone, capital S. Sometimes we experience spiritual, numinous, maybe even supernatural things. And usually, as in my cases, these experiences can be explained a bunch of different ways. But for some people, it seems like it's a lot harder to do that. How's that for awe and wonder? Now again, the point of all this It was not to convince any of you all that, like, given these stories and these bits of evidence and arguments, that, like, you have to be Christian now, logically and rationally. I won the joust. Submit to my superior skills of argumentation. No, these reflections, these arguments, they're not nowhere near close enough to get someone to actual faith in Jesus, let alone a desire to follow Jesus. That takes real relationship, not cognitive science lessons. And you probably right now in your head have questions or counter arguments, right? Like, how does evolution fit into this? Where is my grade A spiritual experience exactly? You might think that I've misunderstood the brain works and that the whole radio thing was like an obvious sham. That's fine. That's not really the point I'm trying to make. The point I want to make is I do think that the fact that we are here, the fact that we have experiences at all, the fact that sometimes those experiences of the world push beyond the natural, I think that's amazing, that's bizarre. I think it's miraculous. And so the actual main thing that I want you to take away from this sermon, beyond the goggles for racquetball, is this. You have permission to feel wonder and awe, even the numinous, a sense of God's reality and God's presence, just like the poet in Psalm 139. Modern society, modern science, modern knowledge has not made belief in God or the experience of God silly, irrational, or obsolete. There are so many things that surpass our knowledge, that are too wonderful for us, that are just so high, we cannot attain them. And so the next time that you feel powerfully moved in worship, when you feel God's presence in worship, push down that voice that says, like, it's just because the music was so good, though Candace and the band are obviously, like, super good. That could be the living and active God reaching down into your life. The next time that you are moved to tears by, like, the feeling of that tiny little hand that's holding onto your hand, push down the voice that says, like, all mammals feel affection for the young. It's like just a matter of propagating the species. No, that's a precious gift from God, who seems to have arranged the entire universe in such a way to make sure that you and that child came into existence. The next time that you are floored by a beautiful hike in the Smoky Mountains, remember, there's just no reason why super advanced monkeys would need to have a sense of beauty and wonder and awe. That too could be, I think it often is, God showing off God's creative mastery and hoping that you, God's creation, will delight in it. So go ahead, be awed, feel wonder. And here's the thing, I think that this could apply to even the smaller and more subtle ways that God is at work in our lives as well. In other words, I don't know for sure, but I think my grandma might be right. I am open to the idea that parking spaces are not always just parking spaces. I've never had a grade A spiritual experience. I've never had a radio suddenly and inexplicably start working. I've never heard God's audible voice or anything like that. I'm not opposed to the idea that some people have. I suspect also that if I am paying attention, if I'm not too, jaded and suspicious, I do think that I might see God at work in the smaller acts in my life, the smaller details in my life, a nudge of encouragement here, a door opening or a door closing over there, maybe even a parking space that just happens to open up at the right moment. And I do think that that too could be an occasion for wonder. Would you please pray with me? Dear God, we are in awe of this incredible world, this amazing universe that you have constructed. The fact that we are here to enjoy it fills me with wonder. Your majesty and your power, they so far exceed our ability to comprehend them. How precious to us are your thoughts, O God. How vast is the sum of them. If we were to try to count them, they would outnumber the grains of sand. If we came to the end, and still we would be with you. We praise your name and we worship you in the name of Jesus. Amen.